I was out camping in a familiar forest in Colorado. I lived a couple of hours away, but came out every couple of months when the weather was nice. I'd already had my camp set up and was there for 2 full days. I spent those days getting the tent situated and going fishing, not really doing much else. On the 3rd day, though, I set out on a hike just north of my campsite. There were no trails out there, so I was just going partially up the mountainside in a general direction. I knew all the landmarks near my camp and had all the necessary equipment to make sure I didn't get lost, so I was just enjoying the walk. It was probably a little past midday at this point, and as I walked further up, I noticed a column of smoke coming from behind me. It almost looked like it was coming from right by my campsite. I walked around to try and get a better view, and as far as I could tell, there was something burning either at my campsite or somewhere in the close area. I quickly made my way back, worrying about what it could be, but I knew that I hadn't left the fire going, so I really had no idea. Once I got about a quarter-mile away from the base of the smoke, it became more apparent that it wasn't directly from my camp. I made it back to confirm, and nothing was wrong with anything. The smoke was coming from somewhere very close, though, just far enough into the trees for me to not see anything. I thought about going and seeing what it was, but the only thing it could be at this point was someone else's campfire. It was strange that someone happened to be out here in the exact place I was, because, again, there were no trails leading to the specific spot. But I definitely didn't want to run into some random people out here, so I stayed at my camp. I didn't really think much else of it. I just went on with my day and did some other things around the camp. Probably an hour passed before I casually looked around and felt my body stiffen when I saw a man standing in the forest. It was so unexpected, and the way he was standing seemed like he was just looking at me, being so oblivious. I had no idea how long he'd been there. I lifted up my arm and did a nervous wave, but the man didn't wave back. He was too far to see if he was actually watching me, but he was definitely facing toward the campsite. After a minute, I went back to what I was doing, but I kept my eyes up and checked every now and then. The man stayed in that same spot for almost 15 minutes before he was finally gone. That had really creeped me out. There just didn't seem to be any reason for someone to be acting like that. I waited a few hours, watching my surroundings the whole time before walking over to where I'd seen the man standing. I wanted to see if there was something there that might have had his attention, but I didn't see anything. It was just another part of the forest. I went back to my camp as the sun was beginning to set. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, and I was overthinking all of it, but the more I really thought about it, the more I got creeped out. By the time the sun had fully set, I still hadn't seen anything else, though. I was sitting right outside of my tent and got the fire going. I don't know how long I was out there for, at least an hour, before I noticed a flickering light to my left. It was from another campfire out in the forest close by. Oddly, it wasn't in the direction I'd seen the smoke coming from earlier in the day, though. It was near where I'd seen the man. I stood up now, feeling that unnerving sense building up in me again. Looking closer, I could actually see the base of the campfire, but it didn't look like anyone was around it. I moved my eyes around the dark forest, carefully scanning the entire area. And as my eyes moved around, I saw something else. Behind a bush, only 10 or 15 feet away, I could see a face looking back at me. My heart stung from the immediate stress and fear that ran through me. For the few seconds I looked at them, though it seemed like the figure didn't think I could see him. He was definitely looking back at me, but remained completely still. I took a few steps back, standing behind my campfire and keeping my eyes locked in the direction of the man. The most terrifying 30 minutes of my life passed extremely slowly before I saw the figure begin moving back, making his way further into the forest. They stayed crouched and moved slowly all the way back until they were fully covered by the dark and the trees. I remained with my eyes wide open and shifting around in all directions for the whole night, not seeing anything more. Once the sun was lighting up the forest enough, I packed up and headed out, walking as fast as I could until I made it back to my car. Whatever was going on out there was far too suspicious, and something told me that staying there any longer would only put me at risk of finding out the extent to their likely harmful intentions. My friend and I lived in a small town outside of Seattle, and for the prior few years, we'd both gotten really into camping and hiking as well. But there was something about setting up a camp and just living out there among the wildlife that hit differently. When this happened, it was spring of 2021. We had planned out a typical camping trip not far away, but with our schedules at work being a little mismatched, it took a bit of finessing to figure out a good few days to go. In the days leading up, though, my manager had to push back my requested days off by a day, which messed everything up. I told my friend, who I'll refer to as Brandon, and he said it was alright since it was just a day off. He said he'd hike out there and set up camp, and just spend the first night alone. He insisted on it and said he'd enjoy it, so who was I to stop him? He let me know when he got there and set everything up, and it all seemed good. On the following morning, I drove out and started making my way to the campsite. This wasn't really a common place, mainly because there were so many other campsites around, but it still had a well-made trail and a cleared-out site that was made for campers to stay at, so it wasn't just some random spot in the forest. I texted him while I was on my way, but lost service before I was able to receive anything back. During the walk, though, there were several times where my phone had gained a bit of service, and I still hadn't gotten a text back. I thought maybe he was having service issues, or possibly there was something wrong with my phone, but basically, there were a million reasons why I didn't get a text back. So, I wasn't too surprised, but once I got to the camp, something was missing Brandon. I checked the tent and the nearby areas, but he wasn't anywhere. I still wasn't too worried. I knew there were a few places around that he could have gone, a nearby river for fishing and a couple of trails with nice views. He really could have been anywhere. I put my bag down and set up my tent, then got a fire going to heat up some canned food I'd brought with. It was only noon, so if he had gone to the river or down a trail, he probably wouldn't be back until 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. But once 5 rolled around, I started to get nervous. I tried to see if I could make out any shoe prints to show which way he may have gone, but honestly, I had no idea. There were a ton of shoe prints all over the area that had no clear direction. My phone still had no service, so there weren't many options for me to go out and find him. My only logical choice was to stay where I was and just hope he came back. Hiking out when the sun only had another 30 minutes of light left was just asking for a disaster. I put some more wood into the fire and sat down, hoping for the best, but uncontrollably fearing the worst. I didn't know if he had gotten hurt, lost, or was just enjoying himself on a hike. And that's when I saw a light flash by a few trees ahead of me. It moved around like someone was walking with it, and it was near one of the trails. I felt some relief, thinking it had to be Brandon. It came closer, getting brighter, and even close enough for me to hear footsteps in the distance. But then all of a sudden, right before I thought I'd see who it was, it shut off, and the footsteps stopped. "Brandon," I called out. It was silent, no movement or response. My stomach tightened, and I called out again, "Brandon? Who's out there?" It remained silent, furthering the disturbing gut feeling I had. To make it all worse, I stared into the darkness, waiting and listening for over an hour, hearing absolute silence aside from the sounds of the woods. I never heard the person leave, but I could feel that he was still out there, watching me. I got up and started packing my things, going quickly, while still watching my back. Something in me just told me to get out of there and find help, so that's what I did. I don't think I was followed, as I made it out without any more incidents, but the police weren't able to help me until the following day. We went back out there, finding everything how I'd last seen it, but Brandon was still gone. They tracked him going off one of the trails and deeper into the woods, showing another set of shoe prints right next to his. Unfortunately, Brandon never turned up, and the whole thing went cold after a couple of days. It's believed that he was likely taken by the person that was out there with him. and that was likely the same person I'd encountered. It's just terrible thinking about whether things would have ended up differently if I had been able to go with him on the first day, or if I, too, would have gone missing. I'm a 26-year-old male, and this happened last year. I was taking a vacation alone, and one of my friends owned a cabin near the area and was planning on visiting. It all worked out really well and saved me a ton of money, which I was super grateful for. This cabin that they owned, I'd never been to, but I'd heard my friend talk about it a lot, and I'd seen pictures. It sounded like the most cozy and relaxing place in the world, and that's exactly what I wanted out of this vacation. It was very isolated, I'd say about 40 minutes outside of the closest town, which felt pretty far for me, though a lot of that time was due to it being located on a dirt road that you'd have to drive really slow on. Anyway, when I arrived, I must have spent a whole hour just standing outside and looking off in the distance, enjoying the nature and quietness. Afterwards, I made an early dinner and was on my phone for a while, then decided to use up the rest of the daylight with a short walk. There were several small trails right next to the cabin that I'd noticed when I was standing out there. I texted my friend to make sure they were actually trails and wouldn't get me lost, but he assured me that I had nothing to worry about. He said the closest one to the back of the cabin was just a straight line through and out of the woods. That sounded perfect to me, so I put on some walking boots and started down the trail. It wasn't the smoothest walking trail, but it wasn't all that bad either. It definitely wasn't anything I could get lost on, and that was my only real concern. I walked for probably just under half an hour, looking at the nature around me and letting my mind wander, until I heard something that confused me enough to get me to stop. But as soon as I stopped, it went quiet. Then, just a moment later, I heard it again, a man's voice speaking loudly with a harsh tone. It sounded somewhat far though. I looked at the woods around me, trying to locate where the man was. I heard him speak again, somewhere far off to the right of the trail, but I still couldn't see him. It sounded like he was talking to someone though, or yelling at them. I didn't want to leave the trail, but something about this made me think there was something wrong. I didn't know if any other cabins or houses were out here, so there was no way for me to really know if it was unusual for anyone to be by this trail, but them not being on the trail made it strange. I listened for another couple of minutes, hearing the man several times speak angrily towards something. It wasn't in English, so I couldn't understand him, and strangely, nobody ever responded, at least not loud enough for me to hear. Eventually, I decided to walk a bit closer to try and see who was there. I didn't want to make myself known. I just wanted to be sure that nothing crazy was going on. I was careful to not lose sight of the trail as I walked deeper into the woods, but once I got closer, all of the talking and yelling stopped. After a moment, I started to get really uneasy and jogged back to the trail. Everything going on just gave me the sense that I was in danger, and being out in the woods was probably the last place I wanted to have that feeling. The sun was beginning to come down as well, so that was my cue to get back to the cabin. I walked quickly, and just a couple of minutes down the trail, I heard leaves crunching from the woods. I jolted my head around, but shadows casting from the trees made it difficult to see clearly. It sounded like someone was running behind me from somewhere out in the woods not too far away. I turned around and ran the rest of the way to the cabin, getting inside and locking everything up. I looked out the back window and immediately saw a man walking toward the cabin. He was wearing a thick hoodie and had something in his hand. In a quick and desperate moment, I made the decision to grab my keys and run for my car at the front of the cabin. I got in and drove off, not seeing anyone follow. After talking with my friend, he made it clear that nobody should have been out there. What that man was doing or who he was yelling at is unknown, but if I had stayed in the cabin, I probably would have never been seen again. Before I get into this next,